Well, welcome back to Bridgeport Stories. My name is Frank Boris. I'm your host. We're recording out of the west end of Bridgeport, and we're happy to have Phil Kuchma with us today. He's a developer in town, and we're going to learn a little bit about the person. You may know of him through what you've read in the papers regarding his developments or his involvement in the city of Bridgeport, whether it's with the chamber or previously as a elected official, or you were an elected official at one time.
I was a city council member for 2 terms.
2 terms, right. And as the man in black. So let's start from the beginning, Phil. If you don't mind, I'd like to learn a little bit about your ancestors. How did they come to this country, and where did they come from, and why did they leave where they were?
Well, both my father's mother and father and my mother's mother and father came here from Eastern Europe. My father's parents came here from the Ukraine when the revolution started in Russia. And
what year are we talking about?
About 1908.
Okay, so turn of the century, like?
Yeah, just after the turn of the century. And about the same time, my mom's parents came here from Russia. And they both wound up in the Lower East Side my mother's parents in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, my father's parents near Bellevue Hospital on the east side of Manhattan. Both my mom and dad, unfortunately, lost their fathers very early in life. My father when he was only 3, and my mother when she was only 9. But So
you never knew your grandfathers?
I never did. They did, but I didn't. Mm-hmm. But both of my grandmothers I was fortunate enough to have as part of my life till I was almost a teenager. So the life that my parents lived in Manhattan was not in Manhattan that you see today, which is a lot of wealthy people. There were wealthy people then there, but it was mostly immigrants that were living in neighborhoods that were very, very densely populated. Whenever I listen to my mom talk about growing up there, it's always wonderful stories.
Were they Russian neighborhoods?
My mom was in a neighborhood that was a lot of Russians and other Eastern Europeans, but a heavy influence of Jewish faith, of people with Jewish faith. My grandparents, though, were both Orthodox.
Orthodox Christians.
Not Jewish, but just Eastern Orthodox. So as it turned out, my dad became a professional singer and musician while he was single. And then when the Second World War came around and he went into the Army, when he was done with his service to the country, he decided to get married and settle down and have what he called a real job.
Before you get there, when you say he was a professional musician or singer, does that mean he was singing folkloric Russian-type tunes, or was he Americanized?
No, he was born here. Both my parents were born here, and my dad actually was a member of a number of big bands, and
oh, really?
Used to play in Manhattan in the winters, and primarily in the Catskill resorts in the warm
So he was
weather.
part of that tour, the Catskills.
Yeah.
Interesting. And had he played with someone that of note during his career?
They were known then, but it wasn't anything. It wasn't
that we
any
would know
of the
today.
names that most of us would relate to those big band era bands. But it was so. What was really interesting though was that although they both grew up in Manhattan, my mom and dad were both here in Bridgeport at a christening for a family that they both had a connection to. And that's where they met. So they met here in Bridgeport.
They met in Bridgeport.
Yeah. And when my dad decided to marry my mom, that my older sister, I have only one sister that's older than me, and she was born in Manhattan. But then my dad got a job at General Electric and moved here to Bridgeport. And when I was born, we lived on Smith Street in the east end of Bridgeport.
Is that Boston Avenue?
Yes, that's
Electric?
where he worked, in the factory there.
Oh, okay. What kind of job did he have?
He was a machine operator.
And what did he do in the war?
He was a soldier, but he had a lot of that's in that time, it was actually early stage radio type equipment, but he became a radio man because he was able to fix and in the field be able to operate the radios. So that's
Oh,
what he did.
really? It's interesting. And your mom?
My mom was 11 years younger than my dad. So when they moved here, she was in her early 20s, but she had worked in a couple of different jobs before they got married. One for Metropolitan Insurance Company, and one in the fashion district there in New York.
Oh,
But
in New York. But how about here?
Here, primarily, once they got here, and we children started being born. My mom didn't work until probably 14 or 15 years after we moved here. At which time, my parents and all of us kids had moved to a home in Stratford.
How many kids?
I have 4 sisters. I had 4 sisters and me, 5.
Oh, so you were raised in a house of 7.
Yes.
Oh, okay. And when you were here, did you have a lot of family members, extended family and things like that?
Most of our family was still in Manhattan, which was great for me because literally from the time that I was prenatal, but from the time I was born, we'd be going in to visit the relatives basically every 2 or 3 weeks. On the weekend, we'd be there in New York. And I had relatives that moved to all different parts of the 5 boroughs. So I became very, very familiar with the city. I've always loved the city. Some of it I love because of what it is today. Some of it I love because of my parents' heritage there and my grandparents. And, it's interesting, but as much as we enjoy technology and products today that are so advanced, when we think about a city like New York City, when I think back about this, my dad's mother that lived right up the street from Bellevue Hospital moved from the apartment she had there in 1971. And at that time, she had never had an electric refrigerator. She still had an icebox. And, there were a lot of people living there that still were, not enjoying some of the things that in those days you would think everybody had. So it was a very interesting. I love the fact that I was brought up in a family that didn't have extra money for anything, and I really appreciate, therefore, that background. And I appreciate more some of the things that I've been able to grow as I've grown older. I've been able to grow to have some things and go to some places that I otherwise wouldn't have.
What is typical, and we always don't want to generalize, but I think stereotypes that are cultural are not necessarily bad, so I think it's okay to talk about it. What might you say is typical of living in a Russian family in America?
First of all, we had 2 Easters and 2 Christmases every year because the Orthodox calendar is different than the Roman calendar. So Christmas is always 2 weeks later, and the Easter holiday sometimes is as far as 5 weeks apart, sometimes on the same day.
I see.
But that was one of the things, especially as a child, that was interesting because that was kind of the only time that I had off from school because it was different than everyone else because I was fortunately very healthy. I didn't miss a lot of school, but it seemed strange to me to be out of school on those days or going to church.
In Stratford, where were you going to school?
I grew up in what was called the Paradise Green neighborhood, which is frankly the kind of neighborhood that people strive for today. We lived on a block that only had 3 sides of the block had streets. The 4th side was connected to a big park where there was a big pond and ball fields and lots of opportunity.
Is that Longbrook Park area?
Longbrook Park, right. Yeah. And one block in the other direction was Paradise Green, which is a small shopping area. So
what year were you born, if you don't mind
year
sharing?
1950.
Okay, 1950.
Yeah,
okay.
1950.
So we're talking in the 1950s and 60s.
50s and 60s, yes. And then I went to high school at Bullard Havens, and I was very fortunate to be a good student, and I was able to grasp things, and I liked, early in life, I guess I liked the idea of doing things with my hands, so I became a carpenter, and after working for a couple of years as a carpenter for other people, I started my business back in 1971.
Did you know you had an acumen for business as well as carpentry? How did that come to be?
the very honest answer to that is when I was growing up, for some reason, I thought I might end up being a police officer or a criminal. I really
One
had,
or the
I
other.
don't know why that crossed my mind, but it did.
Thanks for sharing. That's interesting. All right. So, but neither of those took place.
No, neither of those took place.
So you became a carpenter.
Yes.
And what was it about carpentry that you like? What is it about carpentry?
I think all of us that do anything know that there's a result to what we do. But there's such a visual result to some of the things that are related to construction or anything that has a physical shape or is made of materials that that are not written or oral materials. And that's not to say that every other thing that people create or that people are part of producing aren't as important. They are. But it just, to me, it was, I could appreciate something after I did it by looking at it time and again. And I felt like it was a very productive type of occupation.
Was there a moment when you said, you know what, it's more than just the carpentry. I want to build a business?
Well, yes, there was. And, what's interesting about Bullard Havens, they may do it still 50 years since I graduated, so it's a long time. But they had, when you first go to Bullard Havens as a freshman, you go through what they call an exploratory period where you go to 8 or 9 different shops and learn something about 8 or 9 different trades. And although I really liked carpentry, since my dad had worked in a factory, I kind of said, maybe I'll be a tool maker. So I actually studied tool making in school. But what was great about that for when I decided I wanted to be a carpenter was that the mathematics and the numbers and decimal equivalents and all those things were so, actually, it was such an advantage for me to have over other carpenters because a lot of them never learned those things. But then when I started working, before I even went to high school, I was always earning a little bit of money doing things, whether it was shoveling sidewalks or delivering newspapers or washing basement floors for people. I didn't have money if I didn't earn it. So I was always doing that. So I kind of became a bit of an entrepreneur before I even knew what that meant or what it meant to be in business for yourself. I didn't consider myself in business. I just was earning some small amount of money so that I, had a little bit of extra to help my period of time that.
So you think it was in your DNA?
I think so.
To some degree.
But I never really sensed that either my mom or dad were people that came from a background of entrepreneurship, but also there wasn't a lot of opportunity, especially in Eastern Europe, for their parents.
I remember when I talked to Bob Cinto, I asked him, when did he know he was going to have this empire of his, and he said when he was in a ditch working on boilers and he was all black, and he said, what the heck am I doing here? And that's when he decided to buy his first house or whatever, and he grew it.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting
thing. Did you have a
thing.
moment like that?
No, but I'll tell you what I think is an interesting thing about Bob Cinto and I. When I was, after I'd been in business only 2 or 3 years, a friend of mine wanted to put a dormer on his house. So I did the carpentry, and when we had the shell up, he said, the plumber's coming today to start the plumbing. And when the plumber arrived, it was Bob Cinto, who was working for his uncle, I think, at that time, or his dad. He then became a plumbing, he was in the plumbing business.
Right.
But, we were both working on that little dormer job.
Isn't that something? And now you're both doing development jobs.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Him at a very different scale, but yes.
Yeah. So when did you decide to do, I don't know, did you start a construction company first? What was the first thing that came
When I was 21, I actually formed the business, and it was primarily doing carpentry. But as I was doing the carpentry, I was very fortunate that some of the businessmen that I got to do work for started suggesting to me, why don't you take on bigger things? They liked my, I had a lot of ambition. I was very eager to work as many hours as I could work. And it was basically the opportunities that they gave to me that allowed me to realize that even though I continued to be a carpenter, I could start to hire other vendors to work on the projects with me. And then it got to the point where I actually had a physical ailment that I was having trouble walking, and I had to be treated up in Massachusetts, and they told me I would never really walk well again. But fortunately for me, that wound up not being true. But at that time, I really thought I better start to build more and more of an organization.
How old were you at the time?
At that time, I was about 29.
Okay.
So a long time ago.
And at this point, your construction company is building residential pieces, or were you involved?
At that time, we were primarily doing homes and small commercial jobs. But when I decided to start growing the business, we started doing almost entirely commercial work. We were doing a lot of bank work and a lot of the industry that was here. The industrial jobs were jobs that we really became very active in many of the factories around town, and we still do work for some of them that are still here. But as you know, Frank, there were quite a few more back in that day.
And when did it become development versus construction?
Well, first I started, the first building that I ever purchased to own as a real estate investment was a small building on Madison Avenue here in Bridgeport that I started renovating. It was a building that needed a lot of work, and I started renovating it.
Was it scary buying that first building and putting up the money, or did the bank do that for you, or did you have to collateral?
No, the bank didn't do it. I did have to borrow some money to do it, but it was just before my wife and I got married, and I was I was never much of a spender, so I was able to accumulate a little bit. Mm-hmm. And you were able to buy things in those days with maybe a 20% or so investment in what the total value of the building was. But what happens with commercial property is you have to work very hard to get it filled up. It's one thing if you're buying a home to live in for yourself or something, and you renovate it and then sell it, but you can't have vacant buildings. So I learned very early on not to to try not to take on things that were bigger than I could manage. And at times you still expand a little bit more than you want to, but or most people do, and I did as well sometimes. But I was very fortunate to not try to take on so much that it would be overbearing.
So this first building on Madison Avenue was where exactly? Which building is it?
It was a building that was owned by a man and his wife that had a hardware business. It was called Verdi's Hardware, and he was retiring. And so it's on the corner of Lincoln Avenue and Madison Avenue.
So it's up a little bit, okay.
Yeah. And I bought that building, and I would be working on it in the evenings after doing the jobs that we were getting paid to do during the day. And my wife, then when we got married, and I'd be working on, my wife would start bringing supper to me there, and we'd have supper together sitting on a concrete block or something, and it was it was a good experience for me. I've always been ambitious enough to know that I did put work ahead of any kind of recreation, and never being much of a traveler until I had an opportunity due to the business to travel.
So do you feel like you missed out on something because of it?
Not a bit. I really don't. I say that with 100% sincerity. I really don't. And to this day, my wife and I hardly ever travel except locally, like going into New York or, occasionally. It's kind of laughable to other people, but occasionally I'll have a friend. I had one friend that wanted to buy a house in Jackson, Wyoming, and insisted that he wouldn't buy it unless I looked at it. So I went to Wyoming for one night, and another time I looked for a house for somebody in California, in Los Angeles, and went there for one night.
So you're a real homebody.
I am. Yeah, I am.
And that's a good thing. And so you were married at what age? How old were you when you got married?
24.
24. Did you have kids?
No, my wife and I have no children. We're both enjoying now our 68th year of
Congratulations.
life, and we're very fortunate to have been able to stay on that path where people kind of still go in the same direction together.
So you've been married like 40 years, right?
I've been married 45 years.
That's fantastic. And you still live in Bridgeport?
Yes, I live on Park Avenue, and we had the first house we bought before we got married and lived in was in Bridgeport, and then we moved to Old Town Road in Bridgeport. Then we moved to Trumbull just for a while, and then we moved back to Bridgeport kind of because an opportunity came up in the business that was unexpected. But in 1991, a group of Russian business people had come to New York, and for some particular reason, some people suggested that they were very interested in the infrastructure type companies, things like the water company and concrete plants and things of that nature. So they came to Bridgeport for some reason, and because of my ability to speak a little bit of Russian, especially when I was younger, and being able to meet with these people, the business council had me as part of a meeting with these executives of these coal mines and industrial places in Siberia, and I spent the next day showing them places like the garbage treatment plants and the sewage treatment plants and ONG's concrete plant facility and things. And they were fascinated by some of it because, I grew up in the Cold War time, and frankly, it was always in my mind that we were in competition with the Soviet Union, and they, it was always who had the first man in space, who had the first automobile, all those things, and that competition made me think that their country must be very much like ours. So I was kind of surprised when they were so fascinated by some of the things that are just kind of mundane things to me that we have here. At any rate, they convinced me that I should come to visit them in Siberia.
What's it? Oh, and did you go?
I did.
Oh, wow. What was that experience like?
Well, it was unique. I went there in June of 1991, and while I was there, I was there for about 10 days. While I was there, I signed a contract with the government I was going to build a plant to prefabricate homes because their winters, as you can imagine, or as you probably heard about, their winters are very long and very cold. So my thought was that if they could prefabricate these small homes, and then during the maybe 4 months of decent weather, they could erect them, they would have quite an opportunity. So the government signed a contract with me to build a plant and to create the first 3,000 homes.
Did you do it?
Well, I signed the contract in June, and in August of that year was when the government changed.
Oh, wow.
And when the government changed, everything changed.
Like Gorbachev you're talking about?
Yeah. Oh. So the people that were the political leaders that were there when I was there were no longer the same people. But most of the business people, the people that were running the industrial plants and the mining companies were the same people. So they convinced me to come back again. And they had a project that was a hotel that they had started there. But 7 years previous to that, the construction had stopped. And just the concrete portion of it was there. It was a concrete shell of the entire building. And they asked me to take a look at that and tell them what it would take to complete the building. So I did a study of the building and gave them the information they needed, and fortunately was paid a nice amount of money to do that.
So you did get some commerce out of it.
I did. And the fascinating thing, though, Frank, to me, is that 4 years ago, now that was back in 1992, right? 4 years ago, I was in the Citibank branch on Main Street downtown, right next to McLevy Green. Mm-hmm. And the teller clearly had what I thought to be an Eastern European accent. And so I said, I hope you don't think that I'm being nosy. I said, but what country are you from? I said, it sounds like you might be Eastern European. And she says, yes, I am. She says, I'm from Russia. And I said, well, what city are you from in Russia? And she said, well, you would never know the city. She said, nobody except a Russian might have heard of this city. And I said, well, I'm just interested. I said, what city was it? And she said, Kemerovo. And I said, well, I actually spent time in Kemerovo back in 1991 and 92. And I said, she said, why were you there? I said, I did a study of this hotel that hadn't been completed. And she said, do you mean the Hotel Crystal? And I said, yes. And she said, well, it's built now. And she said, and it is completed. But the fascinating thing is here we are in a tiny city like Bridgeport.
Right. And you come across there.
And that city was 3,000 miles east of Moscow. It's not like it was, a metropolis.
Right.
But fascinating thing.
It is fascinating. And I have a question. You were raised during the Cold War and you're Russian American. What's that like? Is that like being German during World War II? Is it like, what's that like?
I will tell you that some of the parents of my school friends, when I was especially in elementary school, because, I went to elementary school during the 60s, the late 50s and early 60s.
Where'd you go, to Nichols?
No, I went to garden school, which actually isn't there anymore.
Okay.
But, yeah, I went to garden school. And some of the parents, and there was one in particular that I can remember that really were tough on me. I guess I learned to a different extent than other people, unfortunately, learned it. But I learned something about what discrimination is about. Mm-hmm. They thought of me as being some lesser kind of person and some person that they didn't really want their kids to be friendly with,
That's interesting. It's good to hear those cultural stories because we all come from such different backgrounds.
We do.
Where did the black come from?
When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I participated in martial arts a lot. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, in 1971, I was ranked 7th in the United States Karate Association.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And so I
was there a particular type of karate?
Well, it was Chinese style called Pai Lum Kung Fu, which caused us, because of our teacher, caused us to wear black gis. The uniforms were called gis.
Right.
And we would go to tournaments, and we'd be in the vast minority. It was, if there were 200 people participating in the tournament, there might be 3 or so, and they were primarily from our school, but a few others that wore black gis. The rest all wore white gis. And it was, most of the judges were also martial artists that were from styles that wore white gis. And maybe it was just our imagination, but we felt like we always were discriminated against a bit because we wore black gis. And so I began, frankly, at that time, most of the time that I was not at work, I always wore all black, just because I think it made me work harder. It made me think that I had to be better, because when I wore the black gi, I had to be better or I wouldn't win a tournament. I had to really make it so obvious that I did better than the other person that the judges couldn't rule me out. But it's you participate in both what are called kata, which is the routines
dance,
that you do,
if you will, yeah.
And also in fighting. And the fighting is really where we were at the biggest disadvantage. But disadvantage because of the judges, but advantage in that we knew many more techniques to use with our strikes and our blocks.
Was this a great school in Bridgeport? Was there a school, or was this out of your?
No, I went to a martial arts school when I started going when I was 18.
Was it here?
It was in Bridgeport, on East Main Street, actually.
Oh, okay. Who was the master?
Don Mattice was my first teacher, but his instructor wound up moving here, coming up here from Washington, D.C., who was a man that was Chinese. And when he took over the school is when I really started to be the most interested in it, and I started to excel. And
so you rose to what level? You said it earlier.
Black belt.
Black belt, but I mean to say, what was your ranking?
Well, we liked to just say black belt because although there are 10 degrees of black belt in the world of martial arts, with our style, it's really once you reach that level, you continue to improve, but you consider yourself a black.
But you said you were rated highly in the country.
Well, in tournaments, I was rated seventh highest. When you participate in tournaments during the year, the United States Karate Association gives points for how you, when you participate, how well you've done in each of the tournaments.
And so, when did you stop doing that?
Almost right after the tournament that I went to, and when I went to the national tournament in Indianapolis that year, in 1971. I was actually offered a contract to go to Hollywood to be a stuntman.
Really?
Yeah, and
this is during the Bruce Lee era.
Yeah, it was. And when I was offered that contract was just when I was starting my carpentry business. And I evaluated things. And I said, here I am. I'm not yet married, but Mary Beth and I were engaged to be married. And I said, if I go to California, my life is going to be unknown, and maybe it'll go nowhere, and if you get hurt once, you could be all done in a career, just like with sports, right, Frank?
A tough life, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not. So I decided that I wasn't going to be able to stay in it with kind of 1 foot. So 1 foot in, 1 foot out, meaning. But so I decided to I gave up the school that I had in Stratford. I closed the school, and I said I'm just going to focus on the construction.
Wow. That's fascinating because you could have went one way or the other. And isn't it funny how life brings these points of intersection where your decision is going to affect you the rest of your life? And I think you've made a good one. But you never know what the other side was going to be either, right?
You never know.
But you can't look back.
That's right.
And so you never did.
That's right, I never did.
And one building, then the next building, then the next building, and how did that work to this point?
It was in my mind a lot of good fortune. I always think that there are lots of people that work just as hard as one another. There are a lot of people that are have a lot of the same personality traits as one another, but sometimes if you work a little harder, you get a little luckier. So I think my fortunes were good because I did work very hard. I was fortunate to always enjoy it. So I didn't. There's still to this day is never a day that I wake up and I just say I really don't want to go today, or I really don't want to have to be there today. And I was lucky about that. And the opportunities I think that I always saw by being here in Bridgeport, I think are still opportunities for lots of people to take advantage of. And I don't mean in construction, I mean in all parts of life. And I truly believe that. And I really, I always hope to encourage other people to do some of the things that they want to give a try to take a step different than other people.
But in your industry, there's so much money involved, and it's such a big risk. You must not be risk averse. You are willing. You must have to be willing to. You spend a lot of your own money with these ventures that are, you're not sure how it's going to come out.
You're right, Frank. But every time you get in your automobile and drive on the highway, or every time you actually cross a busy street, you don't think about how many people have died in car accidents or gotten hit by a car or something. You do those things, and you are at risk, and sometimes at great risk. But if your mind is always on that part of it, you probably wouldn't do it. You'd probably be frozen, and you wouldn't drive your car, or you wouldn't do things. So I think that it does. It probably does come to people's minds differently, depending on the individual, of course. There are times that you say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done this. But at the minute that you say that, if you just start working harder at making it work, sometimes you'll find that there's a much better chance that it'll come out okay than if you start to say, I give up.
So let me ask you the tough question, and that is, has there been one boondoggle?
Two.
Tell me about them.
There have been two. One was when, back in the late 80s, which was the recession that most people talk about today, trying to compare like what's happened like in 2007. Mm-hmm. But back in the late 80s, actually, it wasn't so much my own risk. I didn't think at the time, but we actually had an opportunity to take on a lot of work from some of the local banks that had taken properties back from people. Unfortunately, two of those banks that we took on a lot of work from were taken over by the government, and we never got paid for large amounts of the money. Wow. So that had a very big effect on the business. But the second time was the building on the corner of Lafayette and Fairfield downtown that started just before 2007. We had to slow down there because the bank, Citibank, frankly, was our lender there. They gave us a construction loan, and they had agreed to give us an end loan. But when the economy fell apart and they were in terrible shape as a bank, they said, we can't give you the end loan anymore. And we had to, with the help of National Development Council, which is an organization, a national organization, but they're headquartered in New York. But Kevin Grems, that works for the company, has an office here in Bridgeport. They helped to work with the city to find a couple of ways.
That was the home loan? Or
that's right. And that was only a small part of the project, but that was kind of the gap part. Right. You know, the home loan part of it was $4 million of a $21 million project, but it was the $4 million that was missing. Mm-hmm. You know, so it was very important. And frankly, that could have been far worse than it was. The good news was that the opinion of people in the city administration and state administration, as well as in the industry, said, you know, this project really does have to happen. It wasn't, and I'm not saying this, I'm not trying to sound ungrateful.
Was it too big to fail?
It wasn't so much that people wanted me to get the benefit of it. They wanted the project to get done, right. You know, and fortunately, I was allowed to be the one to finish it, you know. Right. And that project had a lot of significance for downtown, fortunately, of better things to come.
Are most of your projects self-invested, or do you use a lot of government funds? How do you?
No, very rarely. And as a matter of fact, that building is the first time that there was any kind of loan that was involving the government at all. And that $4 million was federal money that was loaned. Okay. But almost all the time, the projects that I choose have no other investor. That particular project did have another investor, a great friend of mine that soon after that actually passed away. And so there was a fellow who was one of the subcontractors working on the project. He's from Massachusetts, but he was also a person who was investing in real estate, and he decided to take over the part that my partner on that building, Kurt Herscher, had been involved in. Kurt was a great man. Kurt was a fellow that owned the Stevenson Lumber Company, and he was a great man in the community, great man in the business, and unfortunately, he was not able to see the product finished.
You, how many buildings would you say you've been involved with? Wow. Owning? Yeah. Round figure.
Oh, 20 or 22.
All right. So you've done quite a few projects and developments, and you've been involved on Golden Hill Street and on Elm Street, on Fairfield Avenue. Why Bridgeport? Why did you stay? Bob Sinto couldn't take it anymore. He decided to get out because of the shenanigans in Bridgeport. You stayed and have invested in Bridgeport and have made that a priority for yourself. Why is that?
First of all, as I said earlier, I've always seen opportunity here. I truly have seen opportunity, and the opportunities that I am most focused on are helping to have businesses and people that are creative people having opportunities here to get a start and to grow from that point. Secondly, I knew things about the city that were positive things to know. You know, as whenever you're in an area most of your life or all of your life, as I was, you get to understand neighborhoods. I had a huge advantage, I think, in understanding the poor neighborhoods of New York because I always visited them, because my relatives lived there, and I had friendships there. And the only other buildings that other than a building in downtown Shelton that I did before downtown, the only other real estate I've ever purchased to own and invest in has been in Manhattan. And that's a much smaller number of buildings than here. But the opportunity here, Frank, and you've lived most of your life here as well.
Yes, I have.
So you've always heard the same things, that we have such a great geographical location, and
Right.
and we do have that. And the city, unfortunately, didn't take advantage of that very well. And I think that now it finally is. It's very interesting now that it's taken a long time to get over some of the bumps in the road that have been caused by, quite honestly, by problems here, but by people exaggerating the problems. I really think that we live in a city where too many people have developed low self-esteem, and therefore the city has taken on the face kind of low self-esteem. And I think that people that don't even necessarily intend to put Bridgeport down kind of exaggerate the things they hear about it, or they don't come here to see for themselves what the city is like. And they just remember hearing something, and they just remember it was bad. They don't necessarily even know the details of it, but they just remember it not being good. Well, if that was the way people acted about New York City in the 70s, New York City would be far worse than Bridgeport today. But people believed that the city would come back, and people invested in it, and started with a leader, in Mayor Koch. I mean, he really came into a real hellhole in the city in the 70s. And, it was hard to get rid of garbage. The subways and the buildings were full of graffiti, and it was just a very different place. And people have to have belief in their own city. And when people start believing in their city, it works. And now what I have to say that after all these years, the first building I ever purchased downtown was 1976. So that's a long time ago. But now the past 4 largest purchases of real estate in downtown Bridgeport are all by companies that are headquartered in New York. And that means that they're making their own decisions because they're companies that can invest any place they want to. And they're choosing here. They're not being coerced. They're not being given given benefits by the government to buy these buildings. They're buying them because they see that it's a good investment. So I now just hope that doesn't cause the cost of being here to start increasing more than it should, because what we're developing here finally is just like with you and your business, Frank. You can be very comfortable here, but if all of a sudden your costs started doubling, you might not think that it's the place to be anymore, and it might not be a
might
place you
that
can.
bring the tax rate down, though?
Well, the tax rate is higher than it should be. There's no question. But, that is the one thing that people focus on the most. And quite honestly, if you're thinking about running your own home, your family budget, what the most important number is the bottom line, what all the things total.
Right.
So if one is a bit higher than you'd like it to be, but some of the others are lower, and that bottom number is still the
where
right
you want
number,
it to be, yeah.
It's okay.
Right.
You still want to work at getting the tax number down, but that's the situation we have here. First of all, the point of entry here is much lower and makes up in many ways for that annual cost being
But
higher.
is there enough market in Bridgeport, in downtown Bridgeport, that are we seeing enough foot traffic? You're acquainted
It's
with
growing.
this because of all the businesses that are in your buildings. But without the foot traffic and without the attraction drawing people to the city, what is going to make it more viable?
Well, the fact that across our entire country, small cities like Bridgeport and even smaller cities than ours, and obviously the larger cities, are all finding that the attraction of people wanting to be part of a more densely populated area is a growing number of people. Actually, the first 2 years ago was the first year ever that worldwide more people live in cities than in the suburban and rural areas.
Are you seeing empty nesters and millennials moving into your building?
Yes, and actually, the people 40 and above are our favorite tenants because they move in and they tend to stay. You know, the building on the corner of Lafayette and Fairfield is 8 years old now. It's been occupied for 8 years. And we have some tenants that are still the original tenants there. With the younger people, we have had a lot of younger people, but most of them come and go every year or two. You know, they really are not, they want to sample a lot of different places and different geographic locations. I mean, they might move across the country without a job just because they say, I'd like to live there, you know, and I give them a lot of credit for that. But in trying to build the city, I think the strongest thing we have going for us, again, is number one, the accessibility of the city. You know, the modes of transportation to get here are a big advantage. Now that we're having so much mixed use in our downtown, the next biggest thing, and I think Bridgeport's smart at this point to be focusing on it, is the entertainment that's coming to the city is going to be a large driver of the economy here.
Especially if MGM comes in or some other.
Absolutely. But even with the things that are already underway, you know, with just a little bit of change in the management of the Webster Arena, that, you know, we all know. I mean, there's no secret that when they have big name entertainers there, the downtown is flooded with people that are going to the restaurants and things, not just going to the Webster Arena. The new amphitheater that's under construction is going to be a big boost. The comedy club is a boost. The small theaters like the Bijou and the Downtown Cabaret are all things that many other towns and cities would love to have, but they don't. You know,
we have that,
and we have it. Yes, and we just have to do a good job with it. We have to make sure that people realize that it's a much safer city than they think, you know, or that they're led to believe. And, you know, every city has some crime, but if you look at all of the large cities in Connecticut, of which we're the largest population, our crime rate is much better than New Haven's and Hartford's and, frankly, Waterbury's. And, you know, that's not what most people would say if you ask them the question about which city has the most crime. They would say Bridgeport. And it's just not true.
Are these some of the reasons why you decided 15, 20 years ago, whenever it was, you ran for city council, that you decided to do that?
I thought that given the opportunity that I think every American would love to have to be involved as an elected official, I couldn't pass it up. When people were encouraging me to do it, I said, you know, I know this isn't what first of all, I don't believe in career politicians anyway. Right. The city council does not get paid. So it's not like a job, you know, but I did think that why shouldn't I take advantage of being able to give something back to my city that has been good to me and that has been my home, you know, and that's why I took advantage of it. Before that, I had been a member of some boards and commissions in the city, and I always enjoyed participating in the civic type of activity. But being a city council member allowed me to understand much better the workings of the government here. And also, it also made me understand clearly that where I can be the most benefit is doing the things I'm doing in my business and in my personal life, not being an elected official. In other words, I enjoyed doing it. I was happy to do it for 2 terms, but I chose not to get elected again, and I chose not to ever seek higher office because I really thought that the other things that I'm involved with are very important, and that's things like being involved in the business community, being involved in the community in general. I love being involved with the arts community and with the people that are part of what has become my everyday life.
What is one of those gems that you know about that you're involved with, or do you like? I go to see the Greater Bridgeport, the orchestra at the Klein, and it's amazing.
It is.
What are one of those things that you would say to people? Boy, you have to do this thing.
Well, what I think is fascinating is the fact that the amount of artists and art-related people here, both performing art, graphic art, every kind of art, writing, media art, the amount of people we have here involved in that is really fascinating, and they're fascinating people. And I think that as people get to know more and more of them as people, rather than as the product that they develop, I think people will want to be in their company more often.
And by the way, that's part of what we're doing here.
Yes.
Getting to know people a little bit better, more than just their persona on the street. It's really getting to know what's behind the person. So I really want to thank you for coming. Is there a person or a mentor or something that meant a lot to you, or something we haven't talked about that you thought you would share with our audience before we go off?
Sure. Just by chance, when I first started doing carpentry work on my own, even while I was working for a carpentry company, I started doing some what people like to call side jobs, So I had to buy a lumber someplace, and here in Bridgeport, there was a business that's still here. It was called Bridgeport Lumber Company. Yeah. I didn't know anybody there, but it happened to be the first place I went to start to buy the supplies that I needed. And I was very lucky to get to know the owner of that business who had started. His name was Sam Stern, and he was a mentor to me. He saw my the things in me that I didn't identify as strengths, but he did, and he was very kind. He was at that time there was a bank here called Lafayette Bank and Trust, and he was one of the directors of that bank. And he was actually the person that, because he had confidence in me, he started recommending my company and me personally to be doing work for a lot of the business people that he knew and things. And that really opened a lot of doors for me. And then I mentioned that our company does a lot of bank work. We're very, very fortunate to do a lot of work for People's United Bank. But before that, Lafayette Bank and Trust gave me the first couple of opportunities I had to do first renovations to their space, but then building some of their branches, and it was all really started because Sam became a good friend of mine, and I did take advantage of gleaning from these men that I met that were older than me in business, that I'd listen to what they had to say, and I'd watch what they had to do. And Frank, I say this many times. You've probably heard me say it at some of the meetings that we go to jointly, that leadership in a community is very, very important. Not just political leadership, but neighborhood leadership and business community leadership. And if a city is lacking that kind of leadership, it struggles. I was fortunate to grow up in a time where there were some great business leaders here. I mean, when I say great business leaders here, I don't think people like myself hold a
Bridgeport Brass and all these large manufacturers.
Absolutely, and banks. And, and they were people that were not from someplace else coming here to work. They were people that they were invested in these communities also. And they were people whose families had been here, many of them, for generations. And there's nothing better than being able to be amongst those people and emulate some of the things that they do. And, I don't have a lot of formal education. My education I was fortunate to get by being among these people and having the privilege of working for them, to do things and get little glimpses of how they conducted themselves, or how they said things, or what kind of things were important to them. And, what's become far more important to me in life is not measured by dollars or measured by possessions. It's really accomplishing things. And, I'm very fortunate that that's more important to me than the money. You have to have money if you want to do certain things, but accomplishing things can be a great goal.
I would like to leave it at that, seeing as how there's a lot of people who will hear this and hopefully be encouraged by your words. Thank you very much, Phil. And good luck and thank you for staying in Bridgeport and believing.
Well, thank you as well.
Thank you.